When was the last time you checked your backseat at night for a cold-blooded killer? Before cell phones kept us connected and before the internet could debunk our deepest fears, there were stories. Stories that made us scared to flash our headlights at oncoming cars, to avoid remote isolated gas stations, and to keep our hands tucked safely away from the edge of our bed at night. These creepy urban legends kept 90s kids awake at night, and they still scare people today, because sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that never die. The smell of her childhood home wrapped around Emma like a familiar blanket as she dropped her overnight bag in the entryway. At 21, she was too old to still feel this much comfort from her parents' house, but between job interviews and an empty bank account, familiar was exactly what she needed. 2 days of dog sitting wouldn't solve her money problems, but the promise of home-cooked leftovers and sleeping in her old room made it feel a little less like charity. A distinct jingling preceded the blur of golden fur that came barreling down the hallway. Charlie, her parents' golden retriever, nearly knocked her over in his excitement, his tail whipping back and forth with enough force to clear the nearby coffee table. "Hey, buddy," Emma laughed, dropping to her knees to accept his enthusiastic greeting. Charlie covered her face in kisses, just like he had when she'd first picked him out at the shelter on her 15th birthday. 6 years later, a few gray hairs peppered his muzzle, but his eyes still held that same devoted gleam. Living in her tiny apartment meant their cuddle sessions were limited to quick visits these days, making this weekend even more precious. "Be safe, sweetheart." Her mom's hug lingered a moment longer than usual. "And remember to lock all the doors and windows," Emma finished, rolling her eyes good-naturedly. Her father cleared his throat. "The neighbors had mentioned someone's been lurking around after dark, peeping in windows." He tried to keep his tone casual, but Emma caught the concern in his voice. "It's probably just the Thompson kid, causing trouble, but still." "Dad, I'm not 16 anymore." Emma laughed, but something in her father's expression made her laugh fade slightly. "I promise I'll lock everything up. No parties, no boys, no putting metal in the microwave?" She flashed an innocent grin, and they all winced at the memory of the small kitchen fire her sophomore year. Charlie pressed against her leg, his warm weight reassuring. "Besides," she added, scratching behind his ears, "I've got the world's best security system right here. You wouldn't let anything happen to me, would you, boy?" Charlie's tail thumped against the floor, but his eyes were fixed on the darkness beyond the living room window. Ears pricked forward in a way that made Emma's smile falter for just a moment. That evening started perfectly normal. Emma reheated some leftover dinner, narrowly escaping accidentally leaving the fork in the microwave. "Oh my God, they would never let me live that down if it happened again," she chuckled to herself. The evening settled into a comfortable routine, starting with an hour-long phone call to her best friend Katie, followed by a horror movie marathon on the couch. Charlie claimed his usual spot on the floor at her feet, his steady presence a comfort against the on-screen terrors. Emma knew she probably shouldn't be watching scary movies alone in her parents' house, but old habits die hard. Every time the tension built on screen, her hand would automatically reach down seeking Charlie's reassuring touch. It was their ritual, developed over countless late-night movie sessions during her teenage years. She'd stroke his muzzle, and he'd respond with a gentle lick to her hand. Katie had always teased her about this strange little comfort system, but Emma didn't care. Some people had security blankets, she had Charlie. Midnight crept up too quickly. Emma finally surrendered to exhaustion, crawling into her childhood bed with its familiar quilt and all too flat pillows. Charlie settled down into his guard position beside the bed, his breathing a steady rhythm in the darkness. The last thing she remembered was his tail thumping softly against the floor as she drifted off. She wasn't sure what woke her at first. The house had a peculiar stillness that even in the settling of old walls seems too loud. Then she heard it. Drip, drip, drip. The sound seemed to cut through the darkness like a knife, each drop somehow more ominous than the last. Was it rain? Emma strained to listen, but the night outside her window was clear and still, the weather report even promising starlit skies. Drip, drip, drip. Each drop pierced the silence like a hammer against glass, somehow louder than the pounding of her heart. The darkness pressed in closer, making her childhood room suddenly foreign and wrong. Emma's hand crept over the edge of the bed, seeking comfort in their familiar ritual. Charlie's warm tongue brushed against her palm, and she released a shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Safe. She was safe. But the dripping continued, a metronome counting down to something that she didn't want to face. Minutes stretched like taffy. Each time fear clawed at her throat, she'd reach down, and each time Charlie would offer that reassuring lick. But something wasn't right. The house seemed to breathe around her, growing colder with each exhale. The shadows in the corner writhed like living things, reaching toward her bed with dark fingers. Drip, drip, drip. After what felt like hours, Emma couldn't bear it anymore. She reached down one final time, desperate for Charlie's comfort. But her hand met empty air. "Charlie." The whisper fell dead in the frigid room. "Charlie?" louder now, her voice crackling, and the silence that answered was deafening. The dripping continued its terrible rhythm, mocking her growing panic. Her hands trembling so bad it took 3 times to grab the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness like a knife, illuminating the empty floor beside her bed. "Charlie?" Her voice sounded small, childlike. "Come here, boy." Drip, drip, drip. The sound drew her forward like a puppet on strings. It was coming from the bathroom. She slid from beneath the covers, her bare feet silent against the cold hardwood. As she made her way down the hallway, the flashlight beam danced across family photos, turning their familiar faces into grotesque masks. The dripping grew louder with each step towards the bathroom. The door stood slightly ajar, a sliver of deeper darkness beyond. Emma's hand shook as she pushed it open, hinges creaking, a warning she was too late to heed. The sound was unmistakable now, coming from behind the shower curtain that stirred in a non-existent breeze. Drip, drip, drip. Her fingers found the light switch. The fluorescent light sputtered to life, harsh and merciless. Emma reached for the curtain, her mind screaming at her to run, to hide, to wake up from this nightmare. But her body moved forward, drawn by some terrible need to know. One sharp pull, and her world shattered. Charlie, her beautiful, loyal Charlie, hung suspended from the showerhead like a broken marionette. His golden fur, once bright with life, now matted dark and dripping steadily into the porcelain below. His eyes, always so full of love, stared emptily at nothing. Emma's scream died stillborn in her throat as her gaze lifted to the wall behind him. There, written in what only could be Charlie's blood, 4 words burned themselves into Emma's soul. Humans can lick too. Drip, drip.
911, what's your emergency?
Yeah, this is Max at the old Suncoal station. I was just pumping gas for a lady and there's somebody in the back of her car with a knife.
Linda knew she should wait until morning, but the thought of facing Monday without at least a few hours of sleep made her decision for her. The 3-hour drive from Springfield wasn't ideal in the dark, but she'd done it before. And besides, nighttime traffic would be lighter. "You could stay," her sister offered from the doorway. "Call in sick tomorrow." "Can't afford to," Linda replied as she was already hurrying down the front steps. "New job, remember?" The autumn night had turned bitter while they had been inside saying their goodbyes. Linda pulled her jacket tighter and quickened her pace across the leaf-strewn driveway to her car, fumbling with her keys in the darkness. A gust of wind sent dead leaves skittering across her feet as she slid behind the wheel, making her jump despite herself. The dark highway seemed to stretch on for miles into nothing but blackness. She had just passed exit 23 when the gas light blinked to life, its orange glow a silent accusation. Shit! Linda gripped the steering wheel tighter. This stretch of highway was notorious, nothing but dense pine forests for miles. Well, almost nothing. There was that old Suncoal station ahead, the one she'd always promised herself she would never stop at. From the road, it looked like something time had forgotten. 2 ancient gas pumps, hunched beneath a fluorescent sign that flickered like a dying firefly. The kind of place that showed up in the opening scene of every horror movie she had ever watched. But tonight, she didn't have a choice. Her dashboard clock read 11:47 p.m. as she pulled onto the crumbling concrete. The hours posted on the grimy shop window declared that closing time was at midnight. Through the streaked glass, she could make out the attendant. He was barely out of his teens and already counting down the register. Linda hesitated for a moment, wrestling with the decision. Maybe she could make it to the next station. The gas gauge's needle, though, buried deep in the red, told her that wasn't an option. She caught the attendant's eye and mouthed an apologetic, "Sorry." He responded with a wave and what should have been a welcoming smile, but something made her stomach tighten. His movements were too stiff, mechanical almost. The smile stopped at his lips, leaving his eyes dark and watchful. As he emerged from the shop, each step toward her car was deliberately slow. Linda's hand instinctively moved to the door lock. "Just fill it up, please," Linda said, forcing a smile. "I'm sorry about the time." "No problem at all, ma'am." His words were casual, but something in his tone made her skin prickle. He disappeared behind her car and reappeared at the pump on the passenger side. Linda watched him in the rearview mirror, her unease growing. He seemed to be deliberately avoiding looking at her car, his movements almost theatrical in their casualness. Something about his behavior made her throat tighten. What was he doing? She whispered, her breath fogging the cold window. When he returned to her window, his face was masked with a forced calm, but his eyes kept darting, from her face to her car, like a nervous tick. "That'll be $18, ma'am." His voice had changed. It was now taut as a wire. His hands trembled slightly as he took her credit card, his fingers ice cold against hers. "Is everything okay?" The words escaped her before she could stop them. "Yeah, it's just..." He started backing away, still watching her car with strange intensity. "Let me run this inside for you. These old card readers, you know how they are." Linda waited. Above her, the fluorescent lights hummed like angry insects, their harsh glare creating islands of sticky light in the surrounding darkness. Moths battered themselves against the bulbs, their frantic shadows dancing across her windshield like tiny desperate things. When the attendant emerged minutes later, his face was grave. I'm sorry, ma'am, but your card's been declined." "What? That's impossible." Linda's voice rose slightly. "I just paid it off." "Maybe," he glanced at her car again, swallowing hard. "Maybe you should come inside and call the credit card company." The urgency in his voice had evolved into something like desperation. "We've got a phone in the shop." Linda's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Every crime show she had ever watched, every warning her mother had ever given her, screamed not to enter an empty shop with a stranger at night. But what could she do? She couldn't just drive away, and she had no cash in her wallet. It held nothing but receipts and loose change. The cheerful chime of the doorbell hadn't finished echoing when Linda heard the heavy click of the door lock engage behind her. She spun around, her heart slamming against her ribs. The attendant immediately raised his hands, palms out. "Ma'am, please," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the buzzing of the fluorescent lights. "Don't scream, I'm trying to help you." He swallowed hard before continuing. "There's someone in your back seat. I saw him there when I was pumping gas. He was lying flat on the floor, and he has a knife. I've already called the police." A nervous laugh bubbled up from Linda's throat, teetering on the edge of hysteria. "Are you kidding me? This has to be some kind of joke." The words died in her mouth as she saw his face. The raw fear in his eyes wasn't fake. He wasn't even looking at her anymore. His gaze was fixed on something through the window, his face draining of color. Linda turned toward the grimy glass, her movements slow and wooden as if in a nightmare. Her car sat beneath the harsh fluorescent lights, looking exactly as she'd left it, and then she saw it. A dark shape uncurling from the floor behind her seat, rising like smoke. The overhead lights caught something in his hand, a flash of metal that made her blood freeze. Her legs dissolved beneath her. The attendant lunged forward, catching her before she hit the floor. He half dragged, half carried her behind the counter as the first distant wail of police sirens cut through the night air. The detective laid out the evidence photos on her kitchen table 3 days later. The hunting knife was first, almost as long as Linda's forearm. Its serrated edges still carried the traces of rust-colored stains from previous victims. Then came the rest. Industrial-strength rope, already cut to precision lengths, duct tape, zip ties, and finally, a wrinkled piece of paper that made Linda's coffee cup slip from her trembling fingers. It was a list of addresses, written in cramped, meticulous handwriting. Her sister's address in Springfield was crossed out in thick black ink. Below it, her own address was circled twice in red. "He had been waiting in your car since Springfield," the detective said quietly. "Watched you say goodbye to your sister. Waited until you were too far from help to..." He left the sentence unfinished. They caught him, of course. Linda sat through the trial, watched them present evidence of other women he'd followed from Springfield over the past 6 months. Some had been luckier than others. These days, Linda doesn't make the drive to Springfield anymore. Her sister visits her instead. And every time she gets into her car, any car, she checks the back seat twice. Sometimes on dark nights, she thinks about the young gas station attendant and wonders what made him look twice in her car, and what made him notice something wasn't right. She sent him a thank you card once, but it felt inadequate for saving her life. The endless wall of pine trees lining I-75 had started to blur together in Marcus's tired vision. He'd never taken this stretch of Georgia highway before, but after a week of all-nighters and his brutal chemistry final, the promise of shaving 45 minutes off his drive home had become too tempting to resist. But now, at 2 a.m., he was starting to question that decision. The green glow of the clock on the dashboard seemed to mock his exhaustion. He'd been driving for what felt like forever, the only company being the occasional distant growl of a semi-truck and the hypnotic rhythm of the white lines disappearing beneath his headlights. Even the radio had given up, fading to static about an hour back, leaving him alone with the soft hum of his engine and the thoughts of his warm bed waiting for him at home. The forest pressed in on both sides of the highway like black curtains, swallowing his headlights at the edge. Out here, the darkness felt different, thicker somehow, more alive. Miles of nothing but trees and asphalt, and the unsettling feeling that he was the only person left in the world. Movement caught Marcus's eye through the windshield. A black SUV was barreling towards him in the opposite lane, but something wasn't right. There were no headlights, no running lights. Nothing but a shadow moving fast through the night, visible only because the moonlight occasionally caught its windshield like a predator's eyes gleaming in the dark. Marcus blinked, wondering if exhaustion was playing tricks on him, but no. The SUV was real enough, a void cutting through the night that his tired brain almost refused to process. Maybe their lights had failed, he thought, or maybe they'd just forgotten to switch them on after leaving the last rest stop. He had made that mistake himself once, and the ticket had eaten up a month's worth of pizza money. This poor bastard's probably going to get pulled over, he muttered to himself. The memory of that ticket and the lecture from the cop about highway safety made the decision for him. As the SUV drew closer, Marcus did what any decent person would do. He flashed his high beams twice, the universal signal for, hey, your lights are off. He had no way of knowing he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Marcus had allowed himself a small, satisfied smile as he checked the rearview mirror, expecting to see his good deed fade into the darkness. The SUV's headlights flickered to life, but instead of continuing its journey, brake lights suddenly painted the night road crimson. His smile died as those red eyes grew larger in his mirror. The sound of squealing tires cut through the night as the SUV executed a violent U-turn. Marcus's heart hammered against his ribs. Had he somehow offended them? He'd only been trying to help, for Christ's sake. Each glance in the rearview mirror showed the SUV gaining ground, and just when Marcus thought it was about to ram into him, the vehicle swerved into the passing lane. A moment of relief washed over him. Maybe they had just realized they were going the wrong way. That relief evaporated like rain in the desert when the SUV slowed to match his speed, hovering beside him like a shark circling its prey. Marcus suddenly remembered a story his uncle told him at Christmas dinner. Something about a new gang initiation? They drive with their lights off, waiting for someone to flash their high beams, and then the new member has to. He hadn't let his uncle finish the story. His uncle was always trying to scare them, and get a rise out of Marcus's mother by telling scary stories at family gatherings. Movement caught his eye. The passenger window was slowly rolling down, the sound barely audible over his pounding heart. Marcus's knuckles turned white on the steering wheel as he remembered another piece of his uncle's story. Don't look at them. Whatever you do, don't give them a reason. He kept his eyes locked straight ahead, even as the shadows shifted in his peripheral vision, and even as something metallic caught the moonlight. Marcus scanned the darkness ahead, desperate for lights, a town, a gas station, anything, but the empty highway stretched before him for miles like an endless black ribbon. A quick glance in the rearview mirror revealed Marcus's worst nightmare, another set of dark headlights materializing out of the night, bearing down on them fast. His foot pressed the accelerator to the floor, but the SUV matched him effortlessly, like they were tethered together. With trembling fingers, he fumbled for his new Motorola flip phone in the center console, the birthday gift he'd been so proud of just months ago. The 911 dispatcher's voice crackled through the static as he tried to explain his location, each hill stealing precious seconds of connection. I'm on I-75 heading north, black SUV, trying to... And then the call died completely. The second vehicle was on him now. Through his mirror, he could make out 3 hooded figures, their faces lost in the shadows. His heart nearly stopped as a road sign emerged from the darkness. 5 miles to the next exit. No, 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 Marcus whispered. The 5 miles stretched before him like an eternity. The SUV lurched towards him without warning. Marcus yanked the wheel, his tires screaming against the asphalt as the guardrail rushed up to meet him. The second car slid smoothly into the passing lane, boxing him in with practiced precision. They'd done this before, he realized with sickening clarity. Next exit, 4 miles. Through his side window, he could see the SUV's passenger leaning out now, arm extended. Moonlight caught something in their hand, a flash of metal that made his blood run cold. Time seemed to slow as he watched their finger curl around the trigger. 3 miles to the next exit. Marcus's trembling fingers jabbed at the phone's keypad again. Please, I'm on I-75. They're going to... Static devoured his words as another hill killed the signal. His chest felt too tight to breathe. 2 miles to the next exit. The vehicle behind him crept so close, its headlights disappeared from Marcus's view entirely, leaving him in a pocket of darkness between his hunters. The SUV beside him edged forward inch by inch like a noose, slowly tightening. Marcus felt his speed dropping, helpless to prevent it. 1 mile to the next exit. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He was trapped. His little sedan was nothing but prey between these massive predators. Even if he floored it now, the engine's pathetic whine told him it would never break free. That exit sign might as well have been taunting him from another universe. His uncle's unfinished story echoed in his mind. The new member has to... A sob caught in his throat as the SUV's passenger leaned further out, weapon glinting in the moonlight. And then, like an answer to every desperate prayer he'd ever whispered, red and blue lights erupted behind them, flooding the highway like daybreak. The cavalry had arrived, their sirens shattering the night's terrible silence. The effect was instantaneous. Both SUVs moved with terrifying precision as if they'd rehearsed this exact scenario. They cut across the median in perfect synchronization, tires spitting gravel like machine gun fire. Before Marcus could even process what was happening, they'd vanished into the darkness as suddenly as they had appeared, leaving nothing but his pounding heart and the welcoming flash of the police lights behind him. Later, surrounded by concerned officers, Marcus had learned that they had been getting calls about these vehicles all night. They found one abandoned at a rest stop 50 miles south. The discovery in the back seat made his blood run cold. 3 handguns, a meticulously detailed list of license plate numbers, and a stack of Polaroids. One for every car that had flashed their high beams that night. Every single one captured at the exact moment their lights flickered on, as if they'd been waiting. Marcus's stomach lurched when he saw his own car among them, the image taken just seconds before his life became a nightmare. In the corner of each photo, someone had carefully written the time, location, and whether the target had escaped or been collected. Most were marked collected.